content of this program is intended for people who are blind and print impaired. Hello and welcome to our May 2024 edition of Heard Any Good Books Lately? A program from the North Carolina Reading Service. I'm George Douglas. This program is brought to you by the Friends of the State Library of North Carolina, Accessible Books and Library Services, an organization of citizens, volunteers, and patrons, all interested in supporting the library and the services it provides. The Friends Group was founded in 1989 and now has more than 300 members across North Carolina. If you'd like to join the Friends Group yourself, we'll have information on how to do that later in this program. This program is all about books available from the State Library of North Carolina, Accessible Books and Library Services. The library has more than 86,000 titles in its collection. Books and magazines are available in large print, braille, and talking books as well. The library also has more than 11,000 patrons across the state. If you're not a patron but are interested in becoming one, I'll have more information at the end of this program. This month we look at some of the most popular books checked out in the month of April at the State Library of North Carolina, Accessible Books and Library Services. We begin with a new book by Jonathan Kellerman called The Ghost Orchid. Psychologist Alex Delaware and Detective Milo Sturgis confront a baffling, vicious double homicide that leads them to long-buried secrets worth killing for in this riveting thriller from the #1 New York Times best-selling master of suspense, Jonathan Kellerman. Here's the plot. LAPD Homicide Lieutenant Milo Sturgis sees it all the time. Reinvention is a way of life in a city fueled by fantasy. But try as you might to erase the person you once were, there are those who will never forget the past and who can still find you. A pool boy enters a secluded Bel Air property and discovers two bodies floating in the bright blue water. Gio Aguenta, the playboy heir to an Italian shoe empire, and a gorgeous, even wealthier neighbor named Megan March, a married neighbor. An illicit affair stoking rage is a perfect motive. But a double in this neighborhood of gated estates isn't something you see every day. The house is untouched. No forced entry, no forensic evidence. The case has that feeling. And when that happens, Milo turns to his friend, the brilliant psychologist Alex Delaware. As Milo and Alex investigate both victims, they discover two troubled pasts. And as they dig deeper, Megan March's very identity begins to blur. Who was this glamorous but conflicted woman? Did her past catch up to her? Or did Gio's family connections create a threat spanning two continents? Chasing down the answers leads Alex and Milo on an exploration of L.A.'s darkest side as they contend with one of the most shocking cases of their careers and learn that some secrets are best left buried in the past. That is called The Ghost Orchid. It's a new book by Jonathan Kellerman. Now here's one by Robert B. Parker's writer, you might say, Mike Lupica. Robert B. Parker's Fallout, it's entitled. Mike Lupica is the author here. When two seemingly unconnected mysterious deaths occur on his watch, Police Chief Jesse Stone must pull out all the stops to unravel the truth and stop a killer from striking again. Here's the plot. The small town of Paradise is devastated when a star high school baseball player is found dead at the bottom of a bluff just a day after winning the team's biggest game. For Jesse, the loss is doubly difficult. The teen was the nephew of his colleague, Suitcase Simpson, and Jesse had been coaching the young shortstop. As he searches for answers about how the boy died and why, he is stonewalled at every turn, and it seems that someone is determined to keep him from digging further. Jesse suddenly must divide his attention between two cases after the shocking murder of former Paradise Police Chief Charlie Farrell. Before his death, Farrell had been looking into a series of scam calls that preyed upon the elderly. But how do these ghost calls connect to his murder? When threats and gunshots appear on Jesse's own doorstep, the race to find answers is on. Both old and new enemies come into play, and in the end, Jesse and his team must discover the common factor between the two deaths in order to prevent a third. Once again, the book is called Robert B. Barker's Fallout, and it was written by Mike Lupica. Now here's one by a novelist who is on our list just about every month with something, Missing Persons, a private novel, and it's by James Patterson. In Afghanistan, a U.S. pilot is shot down during a covert mission. In New York, a mother is forced to flee with her two young children. Finding the connection between the two will lead the private team right into a deadly trap. A wealthy businessman approaches Jack Morgan, the head of Private, the world's largest investigation agency, with a desperate plea to track down his daughter and two grandchildren who have disappeared without a trace. What at first seems to be a simple missing persons case soon escalates into something much more deadly when Jack discovers the daughter is being pursued by highly trained operatives. As Jack uncovers more of the woman's backstory, the trail leads towards Afghanistan, where Jack's career as a U.S. Marine ended in catastrophe. Jack will need to face the trauma of his past to save a family's future. Once again, it's called Missing Persons, a private novel by James Patterson. Now let's turn to another new book. It's by Greg Hurwitz, and it is called Lone Wolf. Once a Black Ops government assassin known as Orphan X, Evan Smoke, left the program, went deep underground, and reinvented himself as someone who will go anywhere and risk everything to help the truly desperate who have nowhere else to turn. Since then, Evan has fought international crime syndicates and drug cartels, faced down the most powerful people in the world, and even brought down a president. Now struggling with an unexpected personal crisis, Evan goes back to the very basics of his mission. And this time, the truly desperate is a little girl who wants him to find her missing dog. Not his usual mission, and not one Evan embraces with enthusiasm, but this unlikely, tiny job quickly explodes into his biggest mission yet, one that finds him battered between twisted AI technocrat billionaires, a mysterious female assassin who seems a mirror of himself, and personal stakes so gut-wrenching he can scarcely make sense of them. Evan's mission pushes him to his limit. He must find and take down the assassin known only as the Wolf before she succeeds in completing her mission and killing the people who can identify her, a teenage daughter of her last target, and Evan himself. Matched skill for skill, instinct for instinct, Evan must outwit an opponent who will literally stop at nothing if he is to survive. Once again, the book is called Lone Wolf, and it's by Greg Hurwitz. Now let's turn to an interesting book called The Final Witness. A Kennedy Secret Service agent breaks his silence after 60 years. This was written by Paul Landis. Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963. Shots ring out at Dealey Plaza. The president is struck in the head by a rifle bullet. Confusion reigns. Special Agent Paul Landis is in the follow-up car directly behind JFK's and is at the president's limo as soon as it stops at Parkland Memorial Hospital. He is inside trauma room number 1, where the president is pronounced dead. He is on Air Force One with the president's casket on the flight back to Washington, D.C., an eyewitness to Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office. What he saw is indelibly imprinted upon his psyche. He writes and files his report, and yet Agent Landis is never called to testify to the Warren Commission. The one person who could have supplied key answers is never asked questions. By mid-1964, the nightmares from Dallas remain, and he resigns. It isn't until the 50th anniversary that he begins to talk about it, and he reads his first books on the assassination. Landis learns about the raging conspiracy theories and realizes where they all go wrong. This is very much a nonfiction book and a fascinating story. It's called The Final Witness. A Kennedy Secret Service agent breaks his silence after 60 years. That agent was Paul Landis. Now back to the fiction category. Here's a novel called The Second Husband, and this one's by Kate White. This is a review that was done by Barbara Lipkin-Gershenbaum in June of 2022. Here's the story. Kate White receives another tangled web of a thriller in The Second-Hand Husband, which is set on the Connecticut shore in Westport. Emma Hawke suddenly became a widow when her husband Derek Rand was shot and killed in what appeared to be a random street crime. Within weeks of his death, she sold everything and moved to an apartment in New York City. She was thoroughly investigated by the police, and no charges were filed against her or anyone else. The case went cold for years. As she became overcoming her grief, she met widower Tom Halliday and married him. His stepdaughter Brittany is living with them while interning at his company. She and Emma have a strained relationship, which only adds to the latter's already elevated stress level. Emma and Tom have settled into a comfortable life. However, that is interrupted when a detective shows up on their doorstep, asking more questions about the murder, which is still unsolved. Emma's life becomes a nightmare as the investigation probes deeper into her relationships with Derek, Tom, and others. One of the main questions in her mind is how the authorities will interpret the circumstances surrounding her meeting Tom. Emma hires an attorney to help her through the police inquiry. He advises her to speak to them only if he is present, suggests that Tom get his own lawyer in case he also becomes a suspect, and tells both of them to think about all of their social and business activities that occurred around the time of Derek's death. Emma owns a successful business as a forecaster of generational trends and has an office in a building on their property. Her employees know nothing of her history or current situation. Tom has his own thriving business, and both are quite busy. But did they ever cross paths before Derek was killed? As the narrative unfolds, readers learn that some expensive original art was inherited by Derek and his siblings, but questions arise about their authenticity. Also, Tom's chief of staff is murdered, and he discovers that someone has embezzled $500,000 from his company. This all takes a toll on Emma and her marriage. To make matters worse, she finds 3 anonymous threatening notes that further shake her up. Who possibly could be responsible for these? Who has such a hatred for her? The suspense ratchets up as the story moves along. Few clues are solvable here, which keeps readers turning each page at a brisk pace. Kate White has an impeccable talent for straightforward plotting and a writing style that never fails to engage. The Second Husband is a perfect beach read. That was a review by Barbara Lipkin-Gershenbaum in 2022, and once again it was called The Second Husband by Kate White. And you're listening to Heard Any Good Books Lately, a program from the North Carolina Reading Service. I'm George Douglas. Thanks so much for joining me today. Let's continue with a novel by Irene Hannon. This is called Vanished. Here's the plot. Reporter Maura Harrison is lost in the dark in a thunderstorm on a country road when a lone figure appears in the beam of her headlights. She slams on her brakes, but it's too late. She feels a solid thump against the side of her car before crashing into a tree on the far side of the road. Moments later, a man opens her door, tells her he saw everything, and promises to call 911. Then her world fades to black. When she comes to, she is alone. No man, no emergency vehicles, no injured person. But she can't forget the look of terror she saw on that face in the instant before her headlights swung away. After failing to convince the police her story is true, she hires a PI to help her dig for answers. Police detective turned private investigator Cal Burke isn't too sure about Maura's story, but as clues begin to surface, it becomes clear that someone doesn't want this mystery solved and will stop at nothing to protect a shocking secret. From the very first page, readers will be hooked into this fast-paced story from fan favorite Irene Hannon. Vanished is the exciting first book in the Private Justice series. 3 justice seekers who got burned playing by the rules now have a second chance to make things right. Once again, the name of that book is Vanished, and it's a novel by Irene Hannon. The next book we're going to look at is Random in Death by J.D. Robb, and this is a review by Jennifer McCord. It was done on January of this year, 2024. Set in New York City in the 2060s, Random Death is the latest entry in J.D. Robb's police procedural series featuring Lieutenant Eve Dallas. Now, Eve and her elite investigative team at the NYPSD combine their unique talents to chase down murderers in a complicated near-future society. This time they are called to a live music venue where a 16-year-old has just been killed. They learn that Jenna told friends she felt a jab in her arm just before collapsing in the crowd. By the time help arrived, she was already dead. As always, Eve and her New York Police Department team display amazing knowledge about how and why crimes are committed. Each member brings his or her own strengths and values to solving murders, and the connections and relationships between them add depth to the story. Although there is almost no evidence left behind, forensics reveals that a substance administered through a hypodermic needle is the likely cause of death. Such a fast-acting toxin delivered in a precise attack in a crowded room is not an impulsive act. Eve deduces that the murder was well planned. While she waits for the toxicology report, she starts looking into Jenna's background. Why was she targeted? The next evening, another seemingly random assault results in the death of a second young lady who also was out with friends to see a band. However, this time there are more clues. and witnesses are able to describe the clothes the suspect was wearing. With the help of eyewitness accounts and the top NYPSD criminal profiler, the police determine that the culprit is likely an adolescent male who considers himself a social outcast. The profiler also theorizes that he could be acting on feelings of resentment and rejection and targeting random women out of anger. Eve begins by tracking down leads, starting with clothing and shoe stores. Now, from experience, Eve knows that in cases involving more than one random murder, a pattern eventually will emerge. She also is aware that the violence isn't over, and soon there is a third attack. But this time, the intended target survives as the needle jab was not able to penetrate her clothing. Further information confirms that the killer is an intelligent teen with a privileged background. It isn't long before the NYPSD has a suspect in custody and insight into his twisted mind. Like most murderers, this one believes he is smarter than everyone else, especially the police. Eve is such a skilled and experienced interrogator that one of the best scenes in an in-depth book is the suspect interview. How she masterfully manipulates and coaxes the truth out of the perpetrator continues to be a highlight of this series. As always, Eve and her NYPSD team display amazing knowledge about how and why crimes are committed. Each member brings his or her own strengths and values to solving murders, and the connections and relationships between them add depth to the story. Once again, with her deep commitment to law and justice, Eve becomes a passionate voice for homicide victims. Again, that review was written by Jennifer McCord in January of 2024, and the name of the book, Random in Death, by the very popular author J.D. Robb. Now let's talk about a book called The Women by Kristen Hanna. From the celebrated author of The Nightingale and The Four Winds comes Hanna's The Women, at once an intimate portrait of coming of age in a dangerous time and an epic tale of a nation divided. Here's the plot. Women can be heroes. When 20-year-old nursing student Frankie McGrath hears these words, it is a revelation. Raised in the sun-drenched, idyllic world of Southern California and sheltered by her conservative parents, she has always prided herself on doing the right thing. But in 1965, the world is changing, and she suddenly dares to imagine a different future for herself. When her brother ships out to serve in Vietnam, she joins the Army Nurse Corps and follows his path. As green and inexperienced as the men sent to Vietnam to fight, Frankie is overwhelmed by the chaos and destruction of war. Each day is a gamble of life and death, hope and betrayal. Friendships run deep and can be shattered in an instant. In war, she meets and becomes one of the lucky, the brave, the broken, and the lost. But war is just the beginning for Frankie and her veteran friends. The real battle lies in coming home to a changed and divided America, to angry protesters, and to a country that wants to forget Vietnam. The Women is the story of one woman gone to war, but it shines a light on all women who put themselves in harm's way and whose sacrifice and commitment to their country has too often been forgotten. A novel about deep friendships and bold patriotism. The Women is a richly drawn story with a memorable heroine whose idealism and courage under fire will come to define an era. It's called The Women by Kristen Hanna. And speaking of famous and popular writers, here's another book by James Patterson. This one's called Holmes, Marple, and Poe. And this is a review by Ray Palin, that was done in January of 2024, just this year. If you are a fan of classic murder mysteries like I am, the reviewer says, you will simply lose your mind over the title of this book, written by the prolific James Patterson and co-author Brian Sitz. Although Holmes, Marple, and Poe is set in the present and the characters merely bear these famous names, each carries with them an air of mystery and plenty of traits that are reminiscent of these legendary figures. Setting themselves up in what was once a bakery in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn, Brendan Holmes, Margaret Marple, and Auguste Poe now have a place to call home, which also acts as the headquarters for Holmes, Marple, and Poe investigations. Their investigative skills are held in high regard by some members of local and national law enforcement. As a result, they are a high-priced trio who often get the cases no one else is able to solve. The premise of the novel is nicely covered by this opening quote from Dame Agatha Christie. Very few of us are what we seem. It is quite easy for readers to move past the distraction caused by the book's title and accept the fact that these are three brilliant detectives operating in the modern age. At the onset, we see them working with NYPD Detective Helene Gray on a case involving bodies found just north of Manhattan. Unlike the mayor or police commissioner, she has full trust in them. We then meet a billionaire media mogul who has had two extremely rare and expensive pieces of art stolen from his Manhattan apartment, an original First Folio from William Shakespeare, and a 1455 Gutenberg Bible. Holmes, Marple, and Poe find Huntley Bain to be abrasive and unhelpful. Regardless of his demeanor, they need to get down to business, and they assure him that they will keep their investigation low profile. Even though Bain wants them to work exclusively on his case, they just can't help themselves from getting involved in others. Among them, the kidnapping of the daughter of a prominent family and the discovery of numerous bones in a Manhattan subway tunnel. Holmes, Marple, and Poe must face their own set of challenges, including Holmes' addiction to heroin, an unfortunate nod to his namesake. This serious problem easily could be life-threatening, and he desperately tries to keep it from his partners, even though they all reside in the apartments above their Bushwick offices. Patterson and Sitz took a gamble with Holmes, Marple, and Poe, but I'm happy to say that the end result is quite successful. The handling of these literary giants is done with the honor and respect necessary to give the story credibility. I'm sure this is not the last we will hear from this formidable trio. Holmes, Marple, and Poe by James Patterson. And that's all the time we have for this month's edition of Heard Any Good Books Lately? I'm George Douglas. I hope you enjoyed the program. If you'd like more information about how to become a patron of the North Carolina Accessible Books and Library Services, simply Google or search for Accessible Books, North Carolina Library. You can also use the same address to join the Friends of the State Library of North Carolina Accessible Books and Library Services. It's that organization that sponsors this monthly feature on books. This program is intended for people who are blind or print impaired. Heard Any Good Books Lately will be available right after the broadcasts at our website, ncreadingservice.org. Goodbye till next time.